have breaking news. A 7.9 earthquake has struck central Los Angeles. Reports are coming in from many residents who are experiencing injuries, damage to their home, as well as streets and buildings. The governor
person and injured 50. Today's tremor was the most violent of many to hit the city since the original quake killed 6 people and caused damage estimated at $150 million.
It was by far the strongest of more than 100 aftershocks that have rattled Southern California since Thursday's earthquake. This one registered 5.5 on the Richter scale, 6 times less powerful than the main event 3 days ago, but strong enough to cause substantial new damage to buildings and private homes.
4 on the Richter scale. One of the stronger aftershocks hit as a local TV station was on the air live.
And here's another aftershock or another earthquake happening right now. I'm not sure which. I'm going to get under this desk. I apologize for the theatrics. Okay. My goodness, a live earthquake right here.
My God.
And I don't think anything's going to fall on me. I'm watching the lights. Are we still there? I think we've lost you, Clark.
The damage was immediate and widespread. The worst of it seemed to be in and around Whittier, 15 miles from downtown Los Angeles, and near the apparent center.
Was worst hit. At least 6 people died. Hundreds of others were injured, and more still suffered heart attacks. The quake was centered to the west of the San Andreas fault line, which runs the length of California.
It wasn't the great quake Southern Californians have long worried about, but when the earth shook this morning, it was a terrifying taste.
This video camera was rolling when the aftershock hit at 1 minute before 4 o'clock this morning. The tremor lasted for 10 to 15 seconds and terrified thousands of residents.
I have no place to go now. This is my home.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this educational piece. We're going to talk about the LA Softstory Ordinance. The LA Softstory Ordinance was passed just recently in the last 1 year in the city of Los Angeles, affecting over 15,000 buildings in the city of LA. And the purpose of this educational video is to give you an overview of that ordinance and to talk about how it impacts thousands and thousands of people in Southern California. I'll be referring to some slides that I've used in a presentation, and I'll be explaining the ordinance to you and also some of the cost ramifications and how you can deal with retrofitting your building. The ordinance was passed approximately 8 months ago. It affects over 15,000 buildings, and I want to first explain to you what the meaning of soft story is. So let's take a look at a typical building, and I'll try to illustrate that for you. If we take a look at a 3-story structure, which is normally like an apartment building or a condominium structure, and we have 3 floors, and on the very bottom floor, which I'm calling the ground floor, or I guess we could call it the first floor, then that would make it a 4-story structure, but 3 stories above the ground floor. The top 3 floors will have windows, doorways, and the bottom floor is usually what they call tuck-under parking. Tuck-under parking, which I know many of you are familiar with, you probably live in some of these buildings, is when the cars are parked underneath the structure. Now the problem with this, what it creates, as you look at this diagram, is that you have a stiff structure on the top 3 floors, but on the lower floor you have these, I'll call them skinny columns. And these skinny columns, they don't provide the same stiffness as the upper 3 floors. And so what happens is when we have an earthquake, using my red arrows here, and the ground shakes, this entire structure is going to deflect. And when it deflects, all of these loads from the upper floors get transferred down to these columns. And these columns, they don't have sufficient strength to carry those loads. This is the soft story. And what happens when you have a soft story? We've seen plenty of examples of them. It can be quite devastating. Here's an example of a soft story collapse. You can see here the top 3 floors are in reasonably good condition. This floor did collapse, but this one on the lower floor is totally crushed. And the problem here, obviously, is that the people on that lower floor didn't survive. And that's called a soft story collapse. This is in another country. I'll show you an example of what happened here in our own Northridge Meadows apartments. We had a soft story collapse. As you look at this sketch, you'll see this ground floor over here. This entire floor in here was a parking. It was a tuck under parking, and the upper 3 floors collapsed and crushed that tuck under parking. 16 people died at Northridge Meadows apartments. So soft stories are very, very dangerous. This happened in Santa Monica. And you can see the entire building is basically collapsed. We have also a very interesting video which was done by the Japanese Research Center, which they tested 2 buildings, one with a soft story condition and one with a retrofitted soft story condition. Let's take a look at that video. So you can see from the video what happens in a soft story condition. The building with the soft story condition was a total collapse and it actually rolled over. The building that was retrofitted survived. So the city of Los Angeles is identified as a high seismic risk zone. We know that. We live in a seismic risk zone. We have thousands of faults. We have, on average, 2,000 to 3,000 earthquakes a week in Los Angeles, out of which maybe 99% of them are undetected because they're less than magnitude 3. But this is a very high seismically active zone. So the cities that have critical seismic zones, which includes Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, Sacramento, recognize this as a risk and collaborated together to develop the soft story ordinance. And so they have embarked on creating a seismic rating system and a ordinance requiring building owners that have this potential risk of collapse to retrofit their buildings. It's a safety measure. The City of LA created the safety measure, and it's called the LA Seismic Retrofit Program. Los Angeles Seismic Retrofit Program. And this handout, which is available, you'll see the link up on the screen, gives you the basic parameters and also tells the tenants in buildings like this. With over 15,000 buildings affected, it's a fairly drastic ordinance. The timeline for implementing the ordinance is approximately 7 years. Let's go over the timeline. So the building owner has, from the date of the order to comply, which is when they get the notice, they have 7 years to comply with the ordinance. In the first 2 years, they have to submit proof that they have hired an engineer and that they're in the process of retrofitting their building. And the city's quite serious about this. The city will issue the order to comply, and building owners that don't comply will be subject to penalties. So it's a mandatory ordinance, and the tenants will be made aware. Order to comply will be issued, and it will affect the title of the property. So as a building owner, you've got to comply. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how to comply, the cost of compliance, and the different options that you have. in order to meet the compliance. Just as a matter of interest, so that I keep your interest throughout this course, I want you to think about this question, and I'll give you the answer at the end. Which is the safest structure best designed for earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, nuclear attack, and terrorist attack? We have different classifications of structures. We have residential, commercial, hospital, police stations, fire stations. Think about that. I'm going to give you the answer at the end because I want to keep your interest. I'll tell you what the safest type of structure that's available in the commercial space. We'll come back to that later. So when we look at the seismicity of Northern and Southern California, we are in a high seismic zone. On the diagram here, you can see the San Andreas Fault, the red zones indicating the areas of highest seismic risk. And that San Andreas Fault runs all the way from Southern California up through the Bay Area, cuts right through the center of the Bay Area, and then it goes off into the ocean, where it keeps on going all the way up to Alaska. The area south of the Bay Area, going all the way down from San Francisco to Los Angeles through Palm Springs, is one of the most seismically active zones in the world. So there are literally millions of homes that are affected along that San Andreas Fault. We are only referring to, in today's lesson, about the City of LA ordinance, but remember that Los Angeles County has 88 cities, which are all in the same seismic zone, and many of those other cities will also be looking to implement a similar ordinance. So this is going to be going on for some time, and this is the reason that I wanted to post this session so that I could help the public to understand these issues that are involved in the technical challenges that you have to deal with in order to comply with the ordinance and to make your building safe. Why did they pass the ordinance? Well, obviously life safety is the #1 priority. We want to be able to survive an earthquake and not have our buildings crush us. But also there's economics. And if we look at, this is a very interesting slide that was presented, shows the economic loss to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And after Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans suffered a severe economic loss, over $100 billion of loss in their gross domestic product compared to their sister city, Nashville. And New Orleans has never recovered. New Orleans is still struggling after Hurricane Katrina. They have not rebuilt. It has been 10 years, and they're still struggling, and it may be another 10 years before they actually regain their same economic presence. The same thing happened in California in 1906. If we go back 100 years, more than 100 years, to the San Francisco earthquake, and we look at this chart, you will see that in 1906, San Francisco, which is the blue line, San Francisco was the most popular destination in California. It was not Los Angeles. Everybody was moving to San Francisco. You can see the blue line, which is the population curve for San Francisco, and this is the population curve for Los Angeles. Los Angeles wasn't even a third the size of San Francisco. But when the 1906 earthquake occurred, San Francisco was wiped out, and it flipped the dynamics for the state of California. And look at what happened. Southern California, Los Angeles took off, and San Francisco, to this day, more than 100 years later, has never recovered from that impact. So this is a very serious business. It affects not just Los Angeles, it affects the entire state of California. It affects Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento, and the entire economic hub, which is California being approximately, I think, the 7th largest economy in the world. It's a very, very serious matter. So what are we going to do about it? Well, I'm going to show you a couple more examples here, and then we're going to get down to the details. These are also examples from the Northridge Meadows apartments. There's another part of the ordinance which covers another type of building, which is called the non-ductile concrete frame building. We won't be talking about that today. That affects approximately 1,500 buildings, which are concrete buildings, highly subject to earthquake risk. This will be the topic of another class. We'll pick this one up next time, but that's another part of the ordinance that has also been passed. But we'll save that for another day. So what are we doing in the LA Softstory ordinance? The first thing we want to do is we want to identify all the buildings that are at the greatest risk. So this step #1 is being done by the City of LA. The City of LA is doing that. I don't need to go into that with you. They are the ones that are going around and identifying those buildings and then issuing orders to comply. When the owner gets the order, the owner then has to mitigate those risks by strengthening the buildings. The city is also trying to provide some financial incentives to those building owners so that they can help to finance this or create tax benefits. That again is a separate topic. It's outside the scope of this presentation, but there are some financial incentives out there. We're going to focus on this topic, how to mitigate. What do we do? How do we strengthen the building? So here's a great sketch, which I took courtesy of the Los Angeles Times, which kind of explains very nicely in 3 dimensions what the danger is of a soft story. So here on the left hand, you can see the building, which has a pretty robust second story with these weak columns. This is very, very common in Hollywood, Santa Monica. I'm sure many of you are living in these buildings. When you see this type of a framework, that is potentially a soft story and a collapse hazard. In a fairly moderate earthquake, that entire building will collapse. And you can see that illustrated in the second portion of the figure, which shows that under lateral movement, that entire floor will collapse, that entire floor will come down. And obviously, if you have 2 or 3 or more stories up there, and we are, being Los Angeles, being very densely populated, the risk is even higher. So what do we do? Well, the solution focuses on using strengthened columns, either steel columns, moment frames, or possibly shear walls, to strengthen that lower floor so that it does not have a weak stiffness line, so that it doesn't collapse. So what we're doing is we're taking these existing columns and we're either replacing them or we are upgrading them. So again, looking at some more examples, here's an example of tuck under parking. There are thousands of buildings that fall under this category. You can see from this photograph, you have 1 story up above and these very, very, skinny columns that have very little lateral stiffness. This is a collapse hazard. That's a soft story. And then we look at the larger apartment buildings. This is one you can see rows and rows and rows of tuck under parking. 2 stories up above. It's a collapse hazard. This whole thing needs to be retrofitted. So that's how we identify the problem. And once we've identified the problem, now the question is, how do we mitigate it? So I drew this sketch for you before. We have to strengthen the weak column line. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come in with our solutions. Here are the options. One option is retrofit options. We can add new shear walls. I'll explain what that is. A shear wall is essentially a wall that comes in to supplement the stiffness on the ground floor. And you have your upper floors up here, and that creates a higher stiffness. It's basically strengthening using a wall. Another idea is to use a steel moment frame, and we'll talk about a steel moment frame in a second. We can also add new steel columns, which we call flagpole or cantilevered column. I'll go into that in a minute. We can also strengthen the existing columns. If it's already steel, maybe we don't need to replace the existing steel. Maybe we can strengthen it. Maybe we can box it up and create a tube. I'll explain that also. We can strengthen the existing framing with shear walls and or strong walls. We'll talk about that. So here you have 5 options, and it depends upon your structure. It depends upon what the logistics are. It depends on how many floors there are. The first step is to examine the structure, do a feasibility study, and try to see which one of these is the most cost effective. For example, let's say we're looking at, here's an example, hypothetical example, 1, 2, 3, 4 stories over my soft story. In this example, two solutions. One is to put in 2 shear walls, and the other one is to put in a single moment frame. Now, what's the problem with the first one? The first one is most likely going to be cheaper. But the problem is, as you can see, is you lose parking. And that's the problem with shear walls. They take up the parking, and no tenant likes to lose their parking. As of right now, parking is sacred property in Los Angeles. Nobody wants to give up a parking space. So usually, this is not a viable option unless you happen to have an apartment building that has excessive parking. I haven't seen it, but I'm sure there's a few out there. So usually I don't recommend the first option, or it's not going to be accepted by the ownership. Second option is a good option, but I want to go into the details of putting a moment frame in. It's a lot more involved than just what this drawing shows, and we're going to explain that in a moment. Okay. So, and then going back to our other retrofit options, we can also put in steel columns, which we call the flagpole. We can also strengthen existing columns. Let's talk about the steel moment frame. Steel moment frame gets a lot of attention, and I want to explain what a steel moment frame is. Steel moment frame is a combination of columns and horizontal beams that are rigidly connected at the joints. What do we mean by rigidly connected? And let me try to explain that with a simple sketch. If I have a frame which is made of steel, and I apply a load on the side, if these are rigid connections, which they are supposed to be, and everything here is made out of steel, when this deflects, it's going to deflect like this. It's going to deflect in a way that the angle between the column, here's my beam, that angle between the beam and the column always remains at 90 degrees. In other words, there is no rotation. The fact that there is no rotation means that there's a very high bending stress that's occurring on those beam column joints. As opposed to a hinged connection, if we allow rotation, then what happens? The frame would deflect like this. Then it's no longer a frame. Well, it's still a frame, but it's a pinned. If it's pinned, then it will deflect like this because this is allowed to rotate. What's the difference between the two? This one, which is a steel moment frame, will have a shorter deflection. It's much more stiffer. This one, which does not have a moment frame, this is a cantilevered column, will have a higher deflection. So it all depends on whether or not the building can tolerate the higher deflections. What's the difference between the two? The steel moment frame requires a grade beam that has to be dug inside. There's a whole concrete beam that has to go in there. And this connection is a very, very detailed connection. It requires welding, it requires bolting. It's more expensive, but it's the best solution, I will say that. From an engineering standpoint, you can't beat a steel moment frame, but it is also more expensive. The cantilevered column, which is the one shown on the bottom, can be designed with a footing. It's a cheaper solution, in my opinion, easier to install, but it has less stiffness. Now, the question is, in terms of stiffness, you have to look at what do you need. Do you need, if it's only a one-story, we may not need a steel moment frame. Maybe we can do a cantilevered column. So there are multiple options. And the same thing applies when we go to looking at these other choices. So let's look at the wood shear wall. A wood shear wall is essentially a system of studs with a top plate and a bottom plate with plywood sheathing. And what does a wood shear wall do? When you put the plywood sheathing and you apply this force, this plywood sheathing, which sandwiches to the stud, prevents the shear wall from deflecting. It's as simple as that. If you didn't have the sheathing and you just had the studs, the wall is less stable. You apply the load, the studs will just bend. But when you put the sheathing on, it ties it all together, creates a panel. And that's what a shear wall is. Shear walls versus moment frames, which ones are stronger? No question. Steel moment frame, much stronger. Shear walls are the weaker. The flagpole, the cantilevered column, is equivalent to a moment frame, definitely stronger than a shear wall, definitely maybe a little bit more expensive. What about the fourth option, strengthening existing columns? What do I mean by that? Let's talk about that for a minute. So let's say your building has some steel columns already in place. Usually those columns will be in the form of I-beams. They'll look like this. So maybe when we look at your building, we find that the steel columns are already there, but they're not big enough. Well, we can come in and we can weld new plates on the side of that steel column. We can also weld new plate on the stronger side, and we can box that in and create a new column, which is much stronger than the original column. So it's more than one option, and maybe the strengthening of the existing column works. Again, there's no one solution, there's multiple solutions. They apply to different cases, and the job of the engineer is to give you those choices and help you decide as an owner which one you can afford. I don't like to take 5 options and tell my client that they should do only one. I like to present to them maybe not all 5 options, maybe I present only 2 or 3 that I think are the best, and then let the client make the decision, because after all, you have to decide what you can afford. But I'll give you the best 3, and then you make your choice. The other option on the list is the strong wall. So we can also use adding a strong wall. What is a strong wall? So a strong wall is essentially a shear wall, but it's a proprietary shear wall developed by a specific manufacturer, which has a super high strength and it's not as long. In other words, this distance here can be as short as 2 feet. It can be as short as 18 inches. I think they even go down to 12 inches. So what does that mean? It means that if you have 12 inches to work with, you could possibly put in a strong wall. But as you saw with some of the slides that we looked at, 12 inches may sound like a lot. It's about a foot. You may not have a foot. In some cases, some of these columns are only 6 inches wide. If I put in a 1-foot strong wall, what have I done to my parking? I've lost my parking. And again, parking is a sensitive matter. So strong walls can be used in certain instances where if you have the length and you can do it, then by all means it should be considered. But if you don't, then you have to go with the steel moment frame or the cantilevered column. So here's the question I get all the time. Every owner comes to me and says, give me a price. How much does it cost? I get this question all the time. And my answer is, it depends. Okay, I can't give you a cost. We first have to do some sort of analysis. We have to do a step 1. And I emphasize that because, again, my role in this process is as an engineer. I'm not a contractor. I mean, I am a licensed contractor, but I don't practice construction. My job is as an engineer is to evaluate the building and give you your best option. Then you can go and get the contractor of your choice, or I can recommend somebody to you who can give you the price. There are 2 ways that you can proceed. The first way is what's called the Design-Bid-Build process. This is the traditional way. In the traditional way, step 1, we do a preliminary evaluation. Does your building comply? Maybe your building already complies. Just because they gave you the notice, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to do something, because it just means that they're letting you know that you need to examine your building. Is it a soft story? We have to do some destructive testing. We have to come out to the building. We have to cut some stucco. We have to see whether or not the columns are steel or they wood. So we have to do some evaluation unless we have a set of drawings. Then we have to do some calculations. We have to see, going back to the 5 options, which one of the 5 options is going to work? Is there a 6th and a 7th option? So we have to do some engineering. We have to evaluate. Then, after we do the evaluation, you can come up with a cost. And then you can develop your tenant habitability plan, pull your permit, which we will help you with. And at this point is where you retain your contractor and start with steps 6, 7, and 8, which is to engage the contractor and let the contractor go do what they do, which is to build it. This is the preferable option. This is what I recommend, option number 1. Option number 2, another choice. Some people don't want to take the steps of doing the evaluation, the structural design. Some people want a price, and they want it done now. So there are some companies, we call them design-build companies. This is called the design-build process. The design-build process They will do some sort of preliminary evaluation, but now what happens is the contractor steps in at the very beginning, and the contractor will bring in an engineer to prepare a design. So the initial steps of evaluation and looking at options is eliminated for the most part, and the design builder, the contractor, will then just come to you with one option, with one price, and say, that's our price, that's our solution. And they will go straight to design documents. It's definitely a faster procedure, but my advice to you as owners and tenants is that you are then disengaged from the different choices. And sometimes this will work. I'm not saying it's not a bad option. We've done it. We work with contractors, but I just want you to be aware of the two choices, because there are a lot of people that are running around in town who are offering only the second option. I want you to know that there is a first option, and that you should, if you want to economize and create the maximum benefit, that you should at least be aware of it. Again, you're the client, you're the owner, the decision is yours in the end. What are the pros and cons between design build versus design bid build? Design build results in one price, but you can have change orders, may exceed the original budget, because in design build they may not have done the destructive testing. They may not have evaluated all of the different intricacies involved with the plumbing and the electrical. In design bid build, it allows you to control the construction with better plans, design documents, and you control your budget. And I would highly recommend, especially for those of you that have more than 20 units, get a construction manager. Don't try to do this yourself. This is not like adding the flooring on your balcony or changing your sprinklers or doing the plumbing in your bathroom. This is serious stuff. Get a professional. Get a construction manager to represent you. It costs a little bit more. It's a little bit more expensive, but he's a professional and he will represent you. And he will help you to manage your budgets and your schedules. So let's talk a little bit about the cantilevered column solution. The cantilevered column, what I like to use is what's called a structural tube. And a structural tube, exactly what it says it is a steel tube which is then connected down at the base with a steel plate with bolts that then go into a concrete foundation. Why do I like this solution? Because the structural tube can take loads in both directions. It has symmetry. It has symmetry, so when I do a design, and let's say I recommend an 8-inch by 8-inch by half-inch thick structural tube, I like that solution because I get strength in two directions. As opposed to doing an I-beam, a lot of people, they use the I-beam. The I-beam is strong about one axis and weak about the other axis. It's very strong in my little sketch here. It's very strong about one axis, the x-axis, but it's very weak about the y-axis. It does not give you the same strength in both directions. So this is called cantilevered column. It is one of the solutions that we talked about earlier. The flagpole cantilevered column. And remember that you don't have to replace the column, you can also add the column and leave the original column in place. The only problem with that is, let's say your existing column is, a 6-inch pipe column. And here's your parking line. So you have parking space here and a parking space here. If I take that column out and I replace it with an 8-inch column, I'm only impacting it 1 inch on both sides. That's pretty livable. But if I add, instead of replacing, I add a new column, which is say an 8-inch tube. Now I've created this area here, which is now 6 inches plus 18 inches. I've created a 14-inch little segment in there, which really affects the parking. And so my choice is to replace, but again, construction costs are important. You need to get a valid price from your contractor, because again, I'm not the one giving you the quotation. I'm just giving you the design and the advice. And then you have to evaluate which is the right choice, replacement versus adding a new column. Again, if you do a design build approach, you won't have much of a choice in this. The contractor will just give you the choice, and they'll do what is fastest for them. So as we close this session, I want to give you some friendly advice so that when the earthquake hits, you know where to go. It's all about location. When an earthquake hits, we have no warning. It's all about, are you in the right place at the right time? You can also be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So if you're at home, the safest place to be, believe it or not, is in a closet or in a bathroom, in a closed space. You don't want to be in an area where you have large beams and large floors or ceilings suspended over you, because they may collapse. Closed spaces, because the walls are nicely tight, have a higher probability of survival, not just in earthquakes, but we found this also true in hurricanes and in tornadoes. People that were in closed spaces would tend to survive. If you're outside in an open field away from power lines, that's a safe place to be. One of the best places to be is camping. That is the best place to be. You've got all your resources, you got your, hopefully, you have your battery, you got your food. If you're camping, stay there, keep camping. If you're near a school or a hospital, the best place to go is the school or the hospital, because schools and hospitals are specifically designed at a higher standard to withstand earthquake. Schools, hospitals, police stations, and fire stations. But a police station and a fire station will not exactly welcome you unless it's for the wrong reason. But a school or a hospital is made as a shelter. Another safe place is underground parking structures. Underground parking structures are great. If you remember your history in World War II, when the Germans were bombing London, where did all the British people go? They went into the tube and they hid in the tunnels while their entire city was being burned, because the tunnels were the safest. So underground parking structures are very, very safe. So let's get back to the question. Which is the safest structure best designed for earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, nuclear attack, and terrorist attack? And the answer is prisons. Not exactly the place you want to be, but they are very well designed. They are solid, mainly because they're designed for keeping people in, not keeping them out. So not exactly your first choice, but certainly the safest structure. You'll be pleased to know that in the event of a cataclysmic earthquake, our inmates will survive us. We may not survive, but they will survive. So preparing for the next earthquake, should you buy earthquake insurance? Yes, absolutely. I highly recommend it. What's your contingency plan? Make sure you have a contingency plan. My contingency plan, I keep a second home in Las Vegas. And with that, I wish you all a pleasant afternoon, and thank you for attending this class.